Please don't tell my uncle I'm scared. He already has enough people needing him today. The whisper came from behind a velvet curtain in a service corridor of the Grand Hanul Hotel in Seoul, where florists wheeled carts of white peonies past caterers calling out order numbers in Korean and English at once. Amara Chukwu, an interpreter's earpiece looped over one ear, and a guest list she had not finished reading, crouched down anyway. Somewhere beyond that curtain, 300 people were waiting for a wedding to begin. Nobody in charge had noticed that the little girl in the gold hanbok was missing from her mark. By the time anyone official realized the flower girl was not where she should be, the string quartet had already begun tuning, and Amara had already made a decision that was not, technically, hers to make. She was supposed to be translating for an elderly guest arriving from Lagos, not kneeling on cold marble refastening a child's flower crown with a pin that had belonged to her own mother. Nobody thanked her for it. Nobody, as far as she knew, was even watching. That belief would last exactly a few more minutes. What happened next would not be forgotten by anyone seated at the Beck family's table that day. Hours later, dressed for a reception she had nearly lost her invitation to, Amara would be steered by the elbow toward the overflow tent by a woman who had already decided, without asking, exactly what kind of person she was. She would not get the chance to argue her case. Someone else would cross the entire length of the ballroom floor first, in front of every camera in the room, and take her hand instead. This is the story of a small kindness paid for in a hallway nobody was supposed to notice, and the very public cost of collecting on it months later, inside a family that had spent generations deciding, quietly and from a great height, exactly who belonged at their table and who did not. Some debts are repaid in private, with no one else the wiser. This is not one of those debts. This one would be repaid in front of everyone who had ever doubted her. Or the Grand Hanul service corridor ran the length of the ballroom above it, a windowless artery of rolling carts, extension cords taped to marble effect flooring, and staff moving with the particular urgency of people who would be blamed for anything that went wrong. Amara had learned to navigate it in the 3 hours since she'd arrived, mostly by staying out of everyone's way. She was not, strictly speaking, staff. She was Yoon Hee's old roommate from an exchange year that already felt like another life. And she was also, as of 9 that morning, an unpaid trial interpreter for any English-speaking relatives who wandered in, confused. It was Jia, the wedding coordinator, and one of the only people at the Grand Hanul who had bothered to learn Amara's name correctly, who had suggested it. A foot in the door, Jia had called it. Good exposure for freelance work. Amara had said yes because exposure did not pay rent, but connection sometimes did. And because saying no to opportunities was a luxury she had not been raised with. She heard the girl before she saw her, a small sound behind a curtain that a florist's cart had shoved half open and stopped without deciding to stop. Bridesmaids in matching pale green hanbok swept past the gap without looking in. A groomsman checked his phone 6 feet away. The pungmul drummers rehearsing somewhere below sent a low pulse of percussion through the floor, and every time it swelled, the small sound behind the curtain grew smaller. As if the child were trying to fold herself into a shape nobody would need to manage. Amara crouched, not calling for help, not making a production of it the way she had learned from years of being the only person in a room who looked like her, that a calm approach cost less than a loud rescue. The girl was maybe 6 or 7, dressed in a gold ceremonial hanbok, with a flower basket abandoned at her feet, her small hands pressed over her ears. "Hey," Amara said, low, in the same register she used with nervous elderly guests who did not trust their English. "Hey, it's all right. I'm not going to make you go anywhere." The girl's eyes, wet and enormous, fixed on her. "Please don't tell my uncle I'm scared," she said, in careful, school-taught English, as if she had rehearsed the sentence in case she ever needed it. "He already has enough people needing him today." It was such an oddly adult thing for a child to say that Amara filed it away without fully understanding it yet. One more detail in a day that was already full of them. Her name, Amara learned in pieces, was Seo Yeon, and she was meant to walk the aisle scattering rose petals from a basket she had dropped somewhere near the flower station. And she was meant to do it alone because the person who usually walked beside her at these things had been pulled into an emergency involving a caterer, a broken freezer unit, and 40 kilograms of imported seafood that would not survive the afternoon without one. Amara did not ask who that person was. She was too busy locating the basket, refilling it from a spare crate a florist reluctantly surrendered, and trying to remember the Korean word for hairpin, which she eventually gave up on and simply demonstrated instead, easing one from her own low bun. It was a small pearl pin, plain and old, the kind of object that photographs badly and means everything. A piece of her mother that had crossed an ocean with her and now sat, however briefly, fastening a stranger's flower crown into place. "There," Amara said, tilting Seo-yeon's chin up gently to check the angle. "Now it won't slip when you walk." Her earpiece crackled at exactly that moment, Gia's voice tight and fast, telling her the elderly relatives from Lagos had arrived 10 minutes early and were standing confused near the valet stand. And could she please come now? Amara looked at the small, still trembling girl in front of her, whose fear had not actually gone anywhere, only quieted, the way a held breath quiets without releasing. She had a choice that was not really a choice, a paying obligation on one side and an unpaid, unnoticed kindness on the other, and she made it the way she made most decisions that cost her something, quickly before she could talk herself out of it. 2 minutes, she told the radio and crouched back down. "You don't have to be brave the whole time," she told Seo-yeon instead. "Just for the walk. I've got you until then. You're not alone in this room, even when it feels like it." She did not know, crouched on that marble floor with petals scattering around her knees, that the 2 minutes she was stealing from a paying obligation to give to a frightened child would turn out to be the most expensive and most valuable 2 minutes of her year, or that somewhere past the far curtain, a man who had just resolved the freezer crisis in 4 clipped sentences was walking back toward the ceremony at exactly the wrong, exactly the right moment. Or, it was not that nobody at the Grand Hanul cared about Seo-yeon. It was that everybody who might have cared was underwater in their own emergency, and a wedding this size generated emergencies the way weather systems generate rain. A bridesmaid rushed past the girl twice without truly seeing her, calling over her shoulder that the ceremony started in 15. "Go find your seat, sweetheart," without waiting to confirm the sweetheart had a seat to find. An usher redirected her toward the family section, and then got pulled away by a florist arguing about centerpiece placement before he finished the sentence. Madame Cho Sua, the groom's aunt and self-appointed keeper of the day's optics, swept past close enough that her perfume lingered, barked something into a headset about the photographer's positioning, and did not once look down. It was not cruelty exactly. It was the particular blindness of people managing 400 moving variables at once, for whom a quiet child was, by definition, not currently a variable. Amara understood that blindness. She had spent 3 years in Seoul being unseen in smaller, more personal ways, mistaken for a hotel employee in her own apartment lobby. Complimented on English, she had spoken her entire life, asked with genuine curiosity whether she had chosen to move here or been sent. She recognized the particular exhaustion of being visible only when someone needed something explained and invisible the rest of the time. And she recognized it now on a 7-year-old's face, which was somehow worse. She delivered Seo-yeon to the aisle mark herself, out of breath from the sprint to the valet stand and back, having translated 3 sentences of gate instructions for a bewildered great-aunt from Lagos before her radio had gone quiet, long enough for her to double back. Her own dress, borrowed and carefully pressed that morning, now had a smudge of pollen along one hip, and 2 pins had come loose from her hair, and she had missed the entire cocktail hour she had been counting on to make the kind of small talk that turned into freelance contracts. She stood at the edge of the staging area anyway, close enough to be seen doing her job, far enough not to be seen doing the other thing, and watched the coordinators finally notice Seo-yeon was present and accounted for, congratulating themselves on a crisis that had never actually been theirs to solve. The ceremony doors were 2 stories of carved dark wood, and when they opened, the sound that came through them was not music so much as pressure, 300 conversations dissolving into a single expectant hush, the drummers finally released from rehearsal into performance. Seo-yeon froze at the threshold with her refilled basket clutched against her stomach, and Amara, who had no reason to still be standing there, who had a job to return to, and a smudge on her dress and 2 loose pins she had not had time to fix, crouched down one last time anyway. "Look at me," she said quietly beneath the swell of the drums. "Not the room, me." Seo Yan's eyes found hers, wet again, but steadier now. "I've got you," Amara said, the same 3 words from the hallway, meaning something slightly different now, meaning I am choosing to still be here, even though nobody is making me. "You're not alone in this room. You just have to walk in a straight line and throw some flowers. You can be scared the entire way. Nobody will know but us." She gave the girl's shoulder the smallest push, more permission than force, and watched her step through the doorway into the light and the noise, spine straight, chin level, scattering petals in a pattern that looked, from behind, entirely fearless. Amara stayed in the shadow of the doorframe a moment longer than she needed to, one hand braced on the cold wood, aware only now of how fast her own heart was going, aware that somewhere in the transaction of pins and petals and borrowed courage she had lost track of the pearl hairpin, that her hair had come down slightly on one side without it. She did not go looking for it. She had exactly 90 seconds to find her own seat before the processional made that impossible, and she took them, disappearing into the crowd of standing guests without once looking back toward the alcove, where a man in a charcoal suit, delayed by 40 kilograms of imported seafood and arriving through the side corridor at the worst possible moment to have missed everything, and the best possible moment to have seen exactly enough, stood very still, having watched the entire exchange from 20 feet away. Baek Do-jin had missed exactly 11 minutes of his younger brother's wedding, all of them accounted for by a walk-in freezer that had chosen the worst possible morning to fail. And he had spent every one of those minutes assuming the worst about how Seo Yan would handle walking the aisle without him beside her, a promise he had made to his late sister more times than he could count, that her daughter would never stand alone at anything important. He had not expected to find the promise already kept by someone else. From the side corridor, he had a clean, uninterrupted view of the alcove, close enough to hear the low, unhurried register of the woman's voice without catching every word, close enough to see his niece's shoulders drop from her ears to somewhere closer to their normal place. He recognized the posture of someone giving genuine attention rather than performing patience, a distinction he had spent his entire adult life learning to detect, because so few people around him bothered with the genuine version once they learned who his family was. He watched the woman crouch, watched the small, deliberate push at Seo Yan's shoulder, watched his niece walk through those enormous doors with her spine straight, and something in his chest that had been braced all morning finally loosened. He did not know the woman's name. He knew, in the particular way he had trained himself to notice useful details under pressure, that she wore an interpreter's earpiece, that her dress had a faint bloom of pollen on one hip, that she had given up something, cocktail hour or a seat or simply time, to stay in that corridor with a child who wasn't hers. He noticed, too, the small pearl hairpin lying on the marble a few feet from where she'd knelt, fallen loose sometime in the last 2 minutes, catching the light in a way that made it impossible to walk past without seeing it. He picked it up without quite deciding to, turning it once between his fingers, an old, plain, clearly well-loved object, entirely at odds with the borrowed designer dress its owner had been wearing. He put it in his breast pocket and went to find his seat beside his mother, arriving 4 minutes before the processional, the freezer crisis already forgotten, replaced by a single unhurried thought he did not examine too closely yet. He intended to find out who she was. The ceremony itself passed the way expensive ceremonies do, efficiently, beautifully, almost impersonally, vows exchanged beneath an arch of white orchids flown in from 3 countries. Yoon-hee, radiant and visibly relieved that the seafood, the freezer, and her flower girl had all, against considerable odds, come together in time. Amara watched from the 11th row, close enough to see her old roommate's hands shake slightly around the ring, far enough that nobody would mistake her presence for anything but a guest's. She thought twice about the missing hairpin, and both times told herself it did not matter, that it was a plain thing anyway, replaceable. Even as some quieter part of her understood, it was not replaceable at all. She had more immediate problems. The reception would require her to find both the Lagos relatives and whatever contacts Ji-ah had promised to introduce her to, and to do it while looking like a woman who had spent her afternoon at a wedding rather than solving 3 separate crises in borrowed heels. Across the aisle, in the front row reserved for family, Do-jin sat beside his mother and made quiet, unhurried inquiries between the vows and the kiss, leaning toward the wedding planner's assistant during a lull to ask, without much apparent urgency, who the woman in the pale blue dress near the back had been, the one who'd walked Seo-yeon in. The assistant did not know her name, only that she was on Jia's list as an interpreter, hired for the day, possibly a friend of the bride's from university. It was not much. It was enough for Do-jin to file away, the way he filed away every useful fragment of information in a life built almost entirely around useful fragments. And he told himself, reasonably, that he simply wanted to thank her properly, to return an object that clearly mattered to her. He did not examine yet why the prospect of finding her again had settled into his chest with the particular weight of something he intended to see through. The reception began an hour later in the Jade Hall, 400 guests moving from ceremony to cocktails, to a seating chart designed, like everything else that day, with careful attention to exactly who belonged near whom, and it was there, crossing the floor toward the family table, with his niece's hand in his, that Do-jin saw the woman from the corridor again, this time standing very still near the edge of the room, while Madame Cho Sua's hand closed firmly around her elbow. Madame Cho Sua had a system, and the system did not have a category for a black woman standing alone near the family section holding a folded seating chart. So the system supplied its own explanation. Catering staff wandered in from the kitchen corridor, needed redirecting before a guest complained about the wrong sort of person standing too close to the head table. "Excuse me," she said in the brisk, carrying voice of a woman used to being obeyed instantly, and did not wait for a reply before her hand closed around Amara's elbow. "The staff tent is that way, past the kitchen doors. You cannot be here." Amara kept her voice level, the way she had learned to in 100 smaller versions of this exact moment. "I'm a guest. I'm also interpreting for the bride's family. I was just checking the seating for an elderly relative who doesn't read Korean." Madame Cho did not appear to hear a word of it, already steering, already narrating the correction to a passing usher, as though Amara were a piece of furniture that had drifted into the wrong room. Heads turned, conversations paused mid-sentence at 3 nearby tables. The particular hush of people deciding whether to intervene and deciding, as people so often did, that it was not their business. Yoon-hee was 30 feet away, deep in a receiving line, unable to see what was happening to her own guest. Amara felt the heat climb her neck, the specific familiar humiliation of being reduced in public to a category rather than a person, made smaller not through violence but through certainty, through a woman who had not once actually looked at her face. She had absorbed worse before and would again, and she had already begun composing the calm, dignified sentence she would use to extract herself, when a hand closed around Madame Cho's wrist instead of her own. Not roughly, but with an authority that stopped the older woman's momentum entirely. "Aunt Sua," Do-jin's voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that made an entire radius of the ballroom instinctively lower its own volume to hear it. "She's my brother's guest. She's with me." Madame Cho's hand fell away as though it had been burned, her expression cycling through confusion, recognition, and a fast, humiliated recalibration of her own. And for one suspended second, the entire ballroom seemed to be looking at the same 3 people at once. He did not release her elbow immediately after Madame Cho let go. Instead, his hand slid, deliberate and unhurried, from where hers had been to Amara's own, an entirely different kind of grip, an offering rather than a correction. And he simply began walking, giving her no real choice but to walk with him, or make a second scene by refusing. And something in his face told her he had calculated that exact calculus and chosen it on purpose. He led her the length of the ballroom floor, past round tables of watching guests, past photographers who had not been told to stop shooting, straight to the head table where his mother, chairwoman Baek Yeon-suk, sat with an expression Amara could not yet read, and pulled out the empty chair beside his own. "You dropped this," he said, once they were seated, low enough now that it belonged only to the 2 of them, and set the pearl hairpin on the white tablecloth between them, turned so the small worn pearl caught the candlelight. Amara stared at it, then at him, several competing reactions arriving at once: gratitude, suspicion, the specific wariness of a woman who had just watched a rich man solve a problem with a single sentence and understood exactly how easily such men solve problems, and how rarely they did it for free. "Baek Do-jin," he said when she didn't speak, as though the name alone were meant to answer several of her questions. It did answer one. She recognized the surname from the wedding programs, from the hotel's own signage, understood in a single cold drop of certainty that the man who had just publicly rescued her from his aunt was the groom's older brother, an executive in a company that owned the very building they were standing in. "You didn't have to do that," she said carefully, meaning several things at once. Meaning, I don't need rescuing. Meaning, I don't know what you want in return. Meaning, this will cost me more than it costs you, whatever it looks like tonight. "No," he agreed, not disputing it, watching her with an attention that felt entirely unlike the way most people in that room had looked at her all day. "I wanted to. There's a difference. Beck Group is opening an international division next year. We need translators who don't flinch under pressure. I'm not offering that tonight, at someone else's wedding, because that would be exactly the kind of transaction you're bracing for. I'm only asking you to have coffee with me next week, so I can ask properly." Amara looked at the pearl pin on the white tablecloth, at the room still watching them in careful, unsubtle glances, and gave him the only answer that felt entirely her own to give. "I'll think about it." The coffee turned into a formal job interview she had half expected and half dreaded. 3 weeks of contract negotiations that Amara handled with more skepticism than gratitude, insisting on market rate, insisting on a clause that let her keep her other clients, refusing every attempt Do-jin's assistant made to frame the arrangement as a favor rather than a hire. She got the job because she was, by any objective measure, extremely good at it, fluent in 3 languages and fast under pressure in a way that had nothing to do with a wedding corridor and everything to do with a decade of freelance survival. What she had not expected, 6 weeks into the contract, was the black car waiting outside her apartment on a Tuesday evening that was not a work day, or the message from an unfamiliar number that turned out to belong to Do-jin himself. "Seo-yeon has an English assignment due Thursday. She asked for the flower lady, who wasn't scared of anything. Would you be willing? I'll pay your normal rate." Amara sat with the message for longer than she wanted to admit, before replying that she would come, but not for the rate, and that he could donate it to Seo-yeon's school library instead. The first homework session took place at the kitchen table of Do-jin's apartment, a startlingly ordinary room for a man whose family owned the building she'd been publicly rescued in. And Seo-yeon greeted her at the door, already mid-sentence about a mixed-up idiom she'd found in her textbook. "It's raining cats and dogs," which she found both hilarious and deeply suspicious. Amara worked through it with her at the table, sounding out the strange logic of English figures of speech, while Do-jin sat at the counter with a stack of his own paperwork he did not appear to be making meaningful progress on, glancing up every few minutes at a conversation he was clearly not part of, and clearly did not want to be excluded from either. When Seo-yeon triumphantly produced her own idiom, break a leg, and used it correctly in a sentence about her school talent show, Amara laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, and caught Do-jin watching her do it with an expression he smoothed over half a second too late to hide it entirely. The Tuesday sessions became a habit neither of them named out loud. Amara learned the route to the apartment well enough to stop using her phone's map, learned which convenience store on the corner sold the ginger tea Seo-yeon liked after homework, learned that Do-jin's driver had standing instructions to take her home afterward, an instruction Do-jin himself quietly overrode one rainy October evening when the driver called in sick, arriving instead in his own car with an umbrella he held over her the entire walk from the building's entrance, saying almost nothing, the silence somehow more companionable than conversation would have been. Inside the car, rain sliding down the windows in long, amber-lit streaks from the streetlights, he asked, apropos of nothing, what jollof rice was, having overheard Seo-yeon demanding it for her birthday after Amara had described it once in passing. She ended up cooking it in his kitchen the following week, correcting his attempt to help chop onions with the patient exasperation of someone who had grown up in a kitchen where technique mattered, and watching him eat a full second, helping with an expression of genuine, unguarded surprise that made Seo-yeon laugh so hard she nearly fell off her stool. He told her, unprompted over the dishes, that he was the second son, the one who had been raised to run the operational machinery of the company quietly while his younger brother's engagement and wedding generated headlines and champagne toasts, and that he had stopped minding it years ago, mostly. Amara recognized the shape of that sentence, the practiced ease of someone describing an old wound as though it no longer ached, because she used the same tone herself when people asked why she'd left Nigeria and never quite explained the whole of it. That night, walking her down to the car at the end of the evening, Seo-yeon tugging at both their hands to be swung between them, the way small children do, without asking permission, the girl looked up at her uncle with the particular bluntness only a 7-year-old can wield without cruelty. "Is Amara going to be family now?" she asked, and the silence that followed lasted just long enough for everyone in it to understand exactly how large the question actually was. Nobody answered Seo-yeon's question directly that night, and nobody needed to, because the answer kept arriving anyway, in smaller, quieter forms over the following month. There was the Sunday dinner Do-jin invited her to, ostensibly to thank her for the tutoring. That turned out to include Min-jun and a visibly pregnant Yoon-hee, who hugged Amara at the door with the particular fierce relief of a bride who had never gotten the chance to properly apologize for what had happened at her own wedding, and had been waiting weeks for the opportunity. The dinner started stiff, the newlyweds still adjusting to each other's schedules and in-laws in the exhausted, slightly raw way new marriages often were. Min-jun, distracted by a work call he kept apologizing for and taking anyway, until Amara, watching Yoon-hee's jaw tighten for the third time, leaned over and asked, deadpan, whether Beck Group's international division had considered a policy against phones at the dinner table, given how badly the interpreter needed the practice pretending not to understand important business Korean. It landed exactly the way she'd hoped, Min-jun laughing despite himself, the tension breaking, Yoon-hee shooting her a grateful look across the table. Do-jin, watching the exchange from the head of the table, said nothing, but something in his posture eased the way it had in the corridor months earlier, watching a stranger make his niece's fear smaller, with nothing but attention and a steady voice. He noticed, not for the first time, how naturally warmth seemed to move through a room when Amara was in it. Not performed, not strategic, simply present. The way some people had a gift for making silence comfortable, and others, rarer, had a gift for making a table of strangers feel briefly like family. It occurred to him, watching her refill Yoon-hee's water glass without being asked while continuing an entirely different conversation with Min-jun, that his own family's dinners had never once felt like this before she started attending them, and that the difference unsettled him more than he wanted to admit, because it meant he had noticed exactly how much had been missing and for how long. He told her about his sister 2 weeks later, on the rooftop terrace of the apartment building, where he had started meeting her 20 minutes early before Seo-yeon's session ended her homework, ostensibly to review scheduling, actually because the terrace had become, without either of them naming it, a place they went to say things they didn't say downstairs. Ji-won had died 4 years ago, a car accident on the coastal highway during a rare weekend trip she'd taken alone, and Seo-yeon's father, Tae-sung, had folded so completely into work travel afterward that Do-jin had become, in practice if not on paper, the parent who showed up, the one who knew which stuffed animal made bedtime possible and which foods triggered Seo-yeon's allergies, and which teacher to email when she cried at school without explanation. He had never told anyone the full sequence of that, the specific accumulation of small, unglamorous parenting that nobody in his family had ever thanked him for, because nobody in his family had ever really noticed him doing it, too absorbed in Min-jun's visible successes to track the quiet machinery running underneath. Amara listened without offering the platitudes people usually reached for, did not tell him his sister would be proud or that everything happened for a reason, only asked, once he'd finished, whether he'd ever let himself grieve properly or whether he'd simply skipped straight to being useful. The question landed somewhere he had clearly not expected, his jaw working silently for a moment before he answered, honestly, that he wasn't sure he knew the difference anymore. The city spread out below them in a grid of light, Han River bridges glittering in the middle distance, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, close enough on the narrow terrace bench that their hands rested inches apart on the cold railing. His fingers moved first, not quite touching hers, close enough that she felt the heat of it anyway, and she watched him decide, visibly, deliberately, to pull the hand back instead of closing the distance, Some private calculation about timing or fairness or fear, overriding an impulse they had both just felt at exactly the same moment. Neither of them said anything about it. Both of them understood, walking back downstairs a few minutes later, that something between them had shifted permanently, whether or not either was ready to name it yet. The summons came, the way summonses from chairwoman Baek Yeon-suk always came, through an assistant, at a time that was not quite a request, to an office on the 40th floor with a view designed to remind visitors exactly how far up they had been allowed to come. Amara had met Do-jin's mother twice before, briefly at family gatherings where the older woman had been correct and cool and entirely unreadable, and she understood immediately, sitting across the wide lacquered desk from her now, with no one else in the room, that this was not a social visit. "You've been very good for my granddaughter," Chairwoman Baek began, in the tone of someone laying groundwork for a sentence that would not end warmly. "And Do-jin speaks of you with an enthusiasm he rarely affords anyone. I wanted to understand your intentions." Amara kept her hands folded in her lap, her voice level. "I don't have intentions, in the sense I think you mean. I tutor his niece, I translate for his company. Whatever else is happening between us is between us." The chairwoman's expression did not change, but something in the room's temperature did. Beck Group is opening its first international hotel brand next spring, under significant scrutiny from a board that includes 3 of our most conservative shareholders. My son's personal choices will be read as a statement about this family's values, whether either of you intends that or not. I am not questioning your character. I am telling you the cost of proximity to this family is rarely paid by the person who chose it. She named a figure then, not crudely, not as a bribe exactly. It framed instead as a compensation for the inconvenience of stepping back gracefully before the launch. An amount that would have solved every financial pressure Amara had carried since arriving in Seoul. Amara sat with it for a long moment, aware of exactly how much it would have changed her life. Aware, too, that the offer was itself a kind of test, one designed to reveal whether her presence in this family's orbit had a price, and what that price was. "I didn't come here for your approval," she said finally, quietly, without heat. "And I'm not going to perform gratitude for an insult dressed up as an offer. If your son decides I'm not worth the inconvenience, that will be his choice to make, not one you make for him in this office." She stood, gathered her bag, and left before the chairwoman could respond, her legs unsteady only once she was safely inside the elevator, alone, the doors closing on a version of herself she was, despite everything, quietly proud of. She did not tell Do-jin what his mother had said, not that week, not the next, choosing instead to quietly create distance she told herself was practical. A scheduling conflict here, a client emergency there, until 3 Tuesday sessions in a row had been canceled and Seo-yeon's disappointed voicemail messages had grown noticeably shorter each time, as if the girl were bracing for a version of events she didn't yet have words for. Amara told herself she was protecting her own independence, the boundary she had drawn around her identity since she first left Lagos, the fear, sharper than she wanted to admit, of becoming a kept woman inside someone else's powerful, tidy family, valued for her usefulness rather than chosen for herself, indistinguishable in the end from the staff Madame Cho had once mistaken her for. She did not examine too closely whether the fear was really about Do-jin's family or about something older. A childhood spent watching her own mother work twice as hard for half the recognition. A lesson about generosity and cost that had shaped her long before Seoul entered the picture. Do-jin found out what had happened almost by accident, overhearing his mother mention the meeting to an advisor with the satisfied tone of a woman who considered the matter closed, a phrase that stopped him cold in the hallway outside her office. She declined the offer without hesitation, so we should assume she'll simply move on quietly. He did not confront his mother immediately. He went home first, sat with the information the way he sat with difficult data before making a decision, and understood, piece by piece, exactly what Amara had absorbed alone rather than bring to him, exactly what it had cost her to walk out of that office with nothing but her dignity intact. The anger that moved through him was quiet, the kind that didn't raise its voice, but it was total, and by the time he picked up his phone to call his mother, his hand was steady in a way that told him precisely how serious he had already become about protecting something he had not yet let himself name out loud. The photographs surfaced on a small entertainment blog before either of them saw them coming. 3 grainy long-lens shots taken from across the street. The rainy October night Do-jin had walked her to the car under his umbrella, time-stamped and captioned by a stringer named Yuri Bae, who specialized in exactly this kind of speculative gossip about Korea's wealthiest families. The headline did not use Amara's name because the blog did not have it yet, referring to her instead as the mystery nanny cozying up to Bayek Air, language that managed, in 6 words, to erase her career, her degree, and her humanity all at once, replacing it with a role designed to be dismissed. The story spread the way these things did, screenshots forwarded faster than corrections could catch up, comment sections filling with speculation about her motives, her nationality treated as a scandal in itself by a vocal minority who did not bother separating racism from concern about the family's brand image. 2 of Amara's freelance clients, both companies with their own image consciousness, quietly paused ongoing contracts within 48 hours, citing scheduling reasons neither of them believed. Bet Group's stock dipped a fraction of a percent, enough for the board to notice, enough for Mr. Han, the company's head of communications, to request an urgent meeting with Do-jin ahead of the international division's launch event, now only 3 weeks away. Do-jin sat through that meeting with his jaw tight, listening to Mr. Han describe options that range from a denial statement to a request that he simply avoid being photographed with her until after the launch. Careful, sensible corporate language for making her disappear from his life on a schedule convenient to shareholders. He did not agree to anything in that meeting. He also did not, in the exhausted, distracted days that followed, call Amara as often as he had before, consumed by launch preparations, and a mother who used the scandal as fresh ammunition for the argument she had already made once in her office, and Amara, watching the calls thin out exactly when she needed reassurance most, began quietly reaching the conclusion she had feared from the very beginning, that when the cost became real, she would be the one asked to absorb it. The message that finally broke something between them was not cruel, which somehow made it worse. A careful, reasonable text from Do-jin asking whether they could lay low publicly until after the launch, just for a few weeks, nothing personal, purely optics. And Amara read it standing in her own kitchen, with the ginger tea she had bought for Seo-yeon's next visit still sitting unopened on the counter. She understood the practical logic of it. She understood, too, exactly what it confirmed, that when his family's image and her dignity had been placed on the same scale, however briefly, however reasonably, the scale had tipped and he had let it. She thought of Madame Cho's hand on her elbow, of the chairwoman's number written on a slip of paper she had refused, of every version of this same lesson she had absorbed since arriving in this country, that her presence was welcome exactly as far as it remained convenient. She did not reply with anger. She replied with 3 words, understood, and then declined, quietly and without further explanation, to help chaperone Seo-yeon's school field trip the following weekend, an outing she had promised the girl weeks earlier with an enthusiasm neither of them had faked. Seo-yeon called her twice that Saturday and left voicemails that grew from confused to hurt, and Amara let both calls go to voicemail, sitting on her own apartment floor with her phone face down beside her, unable to explain to a 7-year-old the particular exhaustion of loving a family that had, even gently, even reasonably, asked her to make herself smaller for their comfort. Across the city, Do-jin sat in his own apartment with his own phone silent, staring at a launch presentation he could not focus on, aware that something essential had gone quiet between them in exactly the way that mattered, and unsure, for the first time since the wedding, whether he had already lost the thing he had crossed an entire ballroom floor to claim. It was Seo-yeon, in the end, who forced the reckoning neither adult seemed able to reach on their own, appearing in Do-jin's home office 3 nights before the launch with her tablet held out like evidence, the school assignment she'd been working on for a class presentation titled People Who Are Brave, illustrated with a drawing of a woman in a pale blue dress standing very straight in a hallway. I wrote about Amara, she said, in the flat, devastating honesty only children reliably deliver. But she doesn't answer my calls anymore, and I think it's because you told her to stop coming, and I don't understand why you do that when she's the bravest person I know. Do-jin did not have a good answer, because there wasn't one. And sitting with his niece's drawing in front of him, he finally let himself see the situation the way she saw it, without the accumulated adult justifications about optics and shareholders and timing that he had spent 3 weeks constructing. He called Mr. Han that same night and told him, without room for negotiation, that the launch remarks would not include a single word implying Amara had ever been asked to step back, and that if the communications team had prepared any language suggesting she was merely staff or a temporary convenience, it would be removed before he walked onto that stage. Mr. Han argued briefly about board sensitivities, and Do-jin, in the same quiet voice that had once stopped his aunt, cold across a wedding ballroom, told him the board could manage its own sensitivities because he had stopped managing his, around a woman who deserved better than a man who folded the first time it became inconvenient to stand beside her. The launch event 3 nights later filled the Grand Hanul's largest hall with press, board members, and Beck Group's assembled international partners, exactly the audience Mr. Han had spent weeks protecting. And when Do-jin reached the portion of his prepared remarks about the values guiding the company's next chapter, he set the script down entirely. He spoke, unscripted, about a woman who had knelt on a marble floor for a frightened child, who wasn't hers to comfort, who had been publicly humiliated in this very hotel for the crime of standing in the wrong place, while being the wrong color to belong there in someone else's eyes, and who had been right every single time about exactly what she deserved. He did not use her name. He did not need to. Every camera in the room turned, on instinct, toward the back of the hall, where Amara stood near the doors, having come only because Yoon-hee had personally called and asked her to, utterly unprepared for what she was watching happen in front of 300 strangers and every reporter Beck Group's launch had drawn. She found him afterward in a side room away from the press line, still in his suit jacket, tie loosened, the adrenaline of the speech visibly draining out of him now that it was done and could not be unsaid. Neither of them spoke for a moment, the noise of the launch reception carrying faintly through the closed door behind her. "That wasn't fair," she said finally, and watched him brace, clearly expecting a different sentence than the one that followed. "You don't get to decide, in front of 300 strangers, that I'm ready to be public property. That's still mine to choose." "You're right," he said, without defensiveness, the admission immediate and unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before. "I should have asked you first. I got it backward, again, deciding what was best for you instead of asking what you needed." It was, she realized, watching him say it, exactly the honesty she had been missing from every version of the reasonable, careful arrangement his family and his company had offered her. An actual accounting of the mistake rather than a polished apology designed to move past it quickly. "What I need," she said slowly, working it out as she spoke, "is not to be rescued, not from your aunt, not from a gossip blog, not from your mother's checkbook. I need to be chosen by someone who understands the difference between saving me and standing beside me, because I have never once needed saving Do-jin. I needed someone to stop making me the variable that gets managed whenever it's inconvenient." He was quiet for a long moment, absorbing that the way he absorbed difficult truths, fully, without flinching from the parts that implicated him. "Then I'm asking," he said finally, closing the distance between them for the first time without hesitating or pulling back. "Not to fix anything, just to stand beside you, in public, for as long as you'll let me, on whatever terms you set, starting now." He held out his hand, not to lead her anywhere this time, not across a ballroom or toward a rescue, simply an offer, open and equal, and Amara looked at it for a long moment before she took it on her own terms, her fingers closing around his the way a decision closes rather than the way a rescue does. Chairwoman Baek Yeon-suk did not apologize in a single dramatic sentence, because that was not a language she had ever spoken fluently, but she arrived unannounced at Seo-yeon's school presentation 2 weeks later, sitting in the second row beside Do-jin and Amara without comment, and afterward, watching her granddaughter's slideshow about brave people conclude with an unedited photograph of the woman she had once tried to pay to disappear. She turned to Amara in the parking lot and asked quietly, without any of her earlier coldness, what she thought of the International Division's guest relations training materials. A genuine professional question, offered the way one colleague offers respect to another whose judgment has earned it. It was not everything. It was not a grand reversal delivered in a single scene, the way Do-jin's mother had built her entire life around never giving anyone that kind of easy, total surrender. But it was real, a practical door left open rather than a speech about acceptance. And Amara understood, walking to her car afterward, that this was likely the only kind of welcome this family knew how to extend, earned in increments, tested at every turn, and worth exactly as much as it had cost to receive. That evening, back at the apartment that had slowly, without either of them formally deciding it, become somewhere Amara spent more nights than not, Dojin found her at the bathroom mirror trying to fix her hair before Seo-yeon's bedtime story, and produced from his jacket pocket the small pearl hairpin he had carried since a wedding 10 months earlier, cleaned now, the clasp quietly repaired by a jeweler he had never mentioned taking it to. "I kept meaning to give this back sooner," he said, stepping behind her, meeting her eyes in the mirror rather than turning her to face him. "I think I liked having a reason to still be thinking about you." He fastened it into her hair himself, his hands careful and unpracticed in a way that made her laugh softly. The same unguarded laugh he'd first fallen for over a homework table months earlier. And when it was finally secure, he rested his hands lightly on her shoulders and met her eyes in the glass. "You're not alone in this room," he said, echoing words she had once given a frightened child in a hallway neither of them had known would change everything. "And you haven't been for a long time." Months later, on an ordinary Sunday morning, nobody had planned around cameras or headlines or seating charts. The three of them sat at the same kitchen table where the homework sessions had started. Seo-yeon narrating an elaborate breakfast negotiation involving pancakes shaped like animals, Do-jin failing, cheerfully, to produce anything resembling a recognizable elephant, Amara laughing hard enough that she had to set down the spatula. The pearl hairpin sat in her hair the way it had every day since he'd returned it, no longer a fragile heirloom she was careful to hide away, but an ordinary, visible part of her, the way belonging eventually stops announcing itself and simply becomes the texture of an average Tuesday, or, in this case, an average Sunday, in a family that had learned, slowly and at real cost, to make room at its table for someone it had once tried to steer toward the door. As Seo-yeon, flipping through a photo album for a different school project, paused on a blurry image someone had taken at the wedding. A small girl in gold, walking through enormous doors. A woman crouched just out of frame in the shadow of the doorway, and asked, without looking up, whether Amara remembered being scared that day too. "A little," Amara admitted, meeting Do-jin's eyes across the table for just a moment, before answering the rest of the question honestly. The way this family, imperfectly and gradually, had taught her it was safe to. "But I've learned something since then. Being scared and being alone aren't the same thing. And most of the time, somebody is paying more attention than you think. If a moment like that has ever found you, a stranger's hand reaching for yours when you least expected it to be offered, or a debt quietly paid in a hallway nobody was watching, tell me about it in the comments below. And if you want more stories like Amara and Do-jin's, stay with me and subscribe, because this is only the beginning of what this family and this city still has to tell."